All right, everybody, if you want to come forward, get closer, or stay where you're at, we'll get started. So welcome to this meeting entitled For Ukrainian Self-Determination, Building Working Class Solidarity. And we have a fantastic panel tonight. It's sponsored by the Ukraine Solidarity Network and endorsed by the Green Mountain Labor Council, the Vermont Federation of Nurses and Health Professionals, United Academics, Green Mountain DSA, and the Tempest Collective. So thanks to all of our endorsers. My name's Ashley Smith, and I'll be moderating the session. And I'll just introduce all the speakers, but I first want to say a few things about the Ukraine Solidarity Network, which is the sponsor of the event. So 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine back in February 2022, we started the Ukraine Solidarity Network. Many of us had been in solidarity with Ukraine all the way back to 2014 when Russia first invaded and annexed sections of Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. But we formally organized the Ukraine Solidarity Network back in 2022. And we formed in solidarity with Ukraine's struggle for national liberation against Russian imperialism. And so we've taken a firm stand against Russian imperialism. And that doesn't mean we support the government in Ukraine, but we defend the right of self-determination of Ukraine without exception. And we emphasize the building of working class solidarity between workers in the United States, in Ukraine, as well as with anti-war resistors in Russia, and defend their right to organize in Russia, and have built extensive connections with the dissident movement inside Russia, many of whom are jailed, like Boris Kagarlitsky, who's an opponent of the war in Ukraine, and he was thrown into the new gulags that the Putin regime has set up. So we're in solidarity with Ukraine, but we're also in solidarity with all oppressed nations struggling for self-determination, including Palestine. That's why we've raised the slogan, "From Ukraine to Palestine, occupation is a crime." So we're consistent anti-imperialist, and that includes being very critical of the US and NATO. And if you look at Ukraine's struggle, in many ways, it's a struggle against Russian tanks and Western banks, because the Western banking system has trapped Ukraine in a debt spiral and has used that to bully Ukraine into opening up to US multinationals, various cynical economic deals. So we're very much in solidarity with the genuine struggle of working class people to control their own society in Ukraine. Now, just a few words. Probably everybody's hearing about the negotiations in Europe that Trump and Putin have really forced on Ukraine. And if you look at what Putin and Trump are trying to do, they're basically trying to bully Ukraine into accepting a deal that ratifies conquest of whole sections of Ukraine. And if you look at the opinion polls, it's overwhelmingly clear that a majority of people, over 70%, support a ceasefire, but over 70% oppose any concession of territorial land in Ukraine to Russia right now. That's why these peace negotiations are going to be a stalemate in the end. And what I expect to happen is Trump and Putin to jointly bully Zelensky into trying to force him into a concession and a deal that rewards Russian imperialism for its colonial aggression in Ukraine. So what we particularly emphasize tonight is the call for material solidarity with the Ukrainian Nurses Union. And I'll read their statement that they've sent us for the meeting when we get to it in the meeting. But first, I want to introduce our panelists. We've got two panelists, and unfortunately, we expected to have a speaker from VFNHP, the Nurses Union in Vermont, but they couldn't, with all the schedule conflicts, find one for this evening. So we've got two fantastic speakers. First, we'll hear from Tanya Vyhovsky, who many of you know, who's a member of the Progressive Party and is a state senator in the Vermont State House. And then we'll hear from Traven Leyshon, who is a member of the Green Mountain Labor Council. So after that, we'll hear the statement from the Ukrainian Nurses Union, Be Like We Are. So I'll hand it over to Tanya.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for being here. I want to actually start with a short conversation I had just today with one of my friends who's serving on the front line in Ukraine. Today was his 24th birthday. He is a proud leftist and has done incredible research and writing in the leftist history of Ukraine. And so I sent him a quick message just wishing him a happy birthday and checking in. How is he? And the response I got back was, I'm hanging strong. And how are you? And I said, kind of the same. And the response that I got was so indicative of the experience I had all throughout Ukraine from the leftists I met. What he said is, I stand just as much in solidarity with you as you do with me. If you need anything, just let me know. And this was one of the really striking things for me as I was in Ukraine in August. And as I traveled and I met with people, yes, everyone was incredibly nervous about what the Trump presidency meant for Ukrainians. And yes, everyone was incredibly curious about what was happening in the United States. And many people were particularly shocked at how bad things are in the United States. But not a single one of them didn't offer their own solidarity. How can we help you? And that was the striking maturity of the leftist movement in Ukraine in their connectedness across various ideology, across various philosophy, really just being connected in their long-term goal of a leftist Ukraine that works for all Ukrainians, and beyond Ukraine and beyond their borders and beyond that war, a world that works for all working people. And that, again, this was a text message I sent maybe an hour ago and had this little exchange. And it was just so striking to me because that was my experience really everywhere that I went, whether it was soldiers coming in from the front lines to hear me speak or have a conversation with me, or it was the feminists who are fighting for LGBTQ rights in Ukraine and fighting to keep their access to abortion and expand it. Abortion is legal in Ukraine, but doctors are allowed to opt out for philosophical reasons. And so they're doing fundraising to actually create telehealth opportunities for people to access, particularly with women in the military. And I remember actually asking the feminist leader that I was speaking to, how do you suss out the issues that are related to the war and the ones that aren't? And she laughed a little and said, there are no issues that aren't related to the war. And so, as I traveled to 4 different cities, I experienced time in bomb shelters. I experienced, an evening train ride across the country while air raid sirens blared overhead all night long. I experienced having a frantic text message from a friend saying, have you left Dnipro yet? And I was like, yeah, we left about 2 hours ago. And he said, good, because ballistic missiles are hitting the city right now. I experienced certainly not what Ukrainians are experiencing every day, because at the end of 10 days, I got to go home. And certainly not being at the front lines, but I got a taste of what it is like to have the sky actually fall and realize that you still have to get up every day and go to work and send your kids to school. That school may be in a bomb shelter. There were certain regions that I visited where the children's schools are permanently located in bomb shelters because it is too disruptive and too unsafe to constantly have to move them from their classrooms. I experienced being rushed into the subway and sitting in the subway, because the subways in Ukraine are particularly in Kyiv, are very, very deep because of the topography. And so in many instances, if you're not near a bomb shelter, you just go to the subway. Children sleep in subways and get up and go to school the next day. And the incredible resiliency, what I experienced from every single person that I spoke to, and I recognized that was a small, curated subset, largely of leftists, but not entirely, is that they are tired. And as the data shows, yes, they're ready for a ceasefire. They are not willing to be defeated. They are overwhelmingly committed to maintaining their sovereignty and their independence, while also fighting the Zelensky government. Just in the last few months, we've seen protests in the street that, in opposition to the removal of independence for anti-corruption organizations. There are weekly protests around the military contract and firming that up to allow for vacation time and time off from the front lines. There are protests to bring the tens of thousands of Ukrainian children home who have been kidnapped by Russia. And technically, that's illegal under martial law. Mass gathering is not legal, and yet they are doing it anyways, and they're winning. They're winning. They stopped the rollback of corruption policies. They have advanced some of the protections for workers. They have advanced some more protections for military workers. The other thing that I heard overwhelmingly from the military, from people who are serving, is that they don't support the end of conscription at this time, but they do support firm contracts so that people are not serving years and years and years without a break. And it was complex. It was complex to talk to people whose minds had shifted, who at one time when the country was not at full scale active war would have said, of course I don't support conscription. Of course I don't support, all of these things. But the realities on the ground have changed to the point where they've understood the complexity of it. In theory, I don't support this. And given the reality faced in front of me, things don't look like I expected them to. One of the strangest things I have found myself talking about, here's a phrase I never thought I would say, was meeting with a veteran who was operating a leftist drone collective. Again, someone who's a proud leftist. He was disabled and unable to continue serving and pulled together, had previously been working for a company that did a lot of research into drone and aerospace technology. And he eventually peeled away from that and created his own collective where they operate under a collective. They get paid the same amount based on the hours that they work. It's all a share but they are doing research and development and making drones for the front lines. And talking to him about how that arc happened for him was just incredibly eye-opening to the way people can shift and change depending on the realities they're experiencing. I also had the privilege of spending a couple of hours with Maxim Butkevich. For those who don't know who that is, he was is a journalist and a humanitarian and spent a little over 2.5 years as a Russian prisoner of war. He was released last October and jumped right back into doing international journalism and humanitarian work and talking about how that changed him. He spoke to me about how he has read the journals of his grandfather's torture at the hands of the Bolsheviks and how he didn't fully understand that until he was experiencing it. And what struck me about him was how he maintained his humanity. How in October he was released from 2.5 years of an inhuman experience, and in August was sitting at a book festival with me, sharing wine and ice cream with this incredible softness and humanity about the world he wants to see and how the path to that world might not be what his idealistic young self thought it was, but that he did still believe it was possible. He was recently given an award for his work. And just all over the place, these were the stories that I experienced and the things that I heard. And there was also time for me, to dig a little bit more into my own family heritage, knowing that my grandfather fled Ukraine in the late 1940s and through Poland, by way of Poland and Germany, made it to the United States in the mid-ish 1950s. That was really all I knew. My grandmother had a little bit more information about his mother and a little bit more information about his brothers. But we went into the archives and we started digging. And what I discovered was my grandfather fought for Ukrainian liberation, as did his father before him. And that is why he ultimately ended up fleeing Ukraine. He spent his first 1.5 years in a Siberian work camp when he was 4 years old. He spent many of his teenage years living on the streets because he'd been separated from his family. He got a physics degree and for a long time taught physics at the University of Kyiv, and continued to fight for Ukrainian liberation until he came to the space with 2 young girls where he did not feel it was safe. He regularly changed his name. He did his second stint in a Siberian prisoner of war camp in his early 20s. And he spent most of his life hiding from the NKVD, which is the precursor to the KGB. So it was also very interesting to dig through the history of the struggle for Ukrainian independence, because it didn't start in 2022. It didn't start in 2014. It didn't start in 1917. It's been an ongoing struggle that is so deep within the history and the culture.
1,000 years.
Like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Of struggle for freedom and independence. And it is so baked into the everyday life of everyone that I spoke to in the way that they conduct themselves, the way that they work together, the way that they can say, I don't agree with that person on this issue, but we're fighting for the same thing. Or that person used to do things in a really messed up way, but they seem to have come along to fighting for our way. So we're going to give them a chance. It was pretty incredible to see. Some of the other things that I went and I experienced was the grassroots organizing that was going on to support this effort. I was able to visit a group of largely women. Many of the men are otherwise occupied at this time. But it was largely women who have come together, and they work 5 days a week, all days but holidays, weaving camouflage mats by hand to send to the front lines. And it is entirely volunteer. They taught me how to do it. So there's like a square foot of a camo mat that went to the front line that I actually got to weave, which was oddly, grounding. Another group of again, largely women have organized collecting surplus produce from farmers all across the country and raising money to buy meat that they then freeze dry and put into little Ziploc bags to use drones to drop to the front lines to troops who've been cut off from supply lines, basically to keep them alive. And it's not like what our military eats, the meals ready to eat that is perhaps created in a laboratory. It's good food. They were sending borscht and nuts and dried fruit with oatmeal and all that had to be done to make it what you'd serve in your kitchen was add hot water. And it was pretty, again, just incredible to see the different ways that people are stepping up across age group, across political ideology, across philosophical ideology to come together and say, we have to beat the existential crisis that is facing us. And we in this country have existential crises facing us as well. Mm-hmm. What I have yet to see is the unity in everyone coming together to push back against it. And the reality of it is we're at a point in time where, yes, Ukraine is on the front lines of the fight against fascism and authoritarianism, but the whole world is in that fight. We're not all on the front lines, but we are all in that fight. And so I think global working class solidarity has always been important, but at this point, it's never been more critical. If we are going to beat the rise in global authoritarianism, we will only do so with true collective working class solidarity across the globe. And I think I'm actually just going to stop there, and we can take questions later if I miss something.
There's so much to say, and
Yes.
I want to thank you for really giving kind of the human face of this. The experiences, the personal, the people you met, and what they're going through, and how they're hanging together. I'm speaking as a supporter of the Ukraine Solidarity Network, and I want to talk really about our perspective. Ashley said briefly quite a bit, but I want to say more. I'm also speaking as the president of a small labor council, and I am a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. But here I'm speaking, for myself. There's been a lot of, to put it euphemistically, confusion and disorientation in the left, primarily in this country, but also within the Western left. And these are really critically important issues to get straight. So the Ukraine Solidarity Network, our purpose is we reach out to unions as well as individuals to build the political and the material support for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian people, particularly their independent unions and the left's resistance in Ukraine, which is quite real. The organizations that exist there, there's been a coming together of the left, socialists, left anarchists, and others, feminists, working together and building a vision and working together ultimately towards a struggling for an independent Ukraine that's egalitarian and democratic. And along the way, yes, pushing back against the attacks not only of Putin, but also of the really the corruption that exists of the oligarchs in Ukraine, and including of the Zelensky government, which has frankly used this war to attack independent organizations, including trade unions. So we're organizing against to end this criminal invasion, to do what we can to give material support as we can, and we work together with other solidarity networks across, well, particularly in Western Europe, where it's quite strong, and where there's a strong union organized backbone in that solidarity work. We've got to deal with the genocidal ambitions and understand them, what we see happening. This doesn't, and I want to be clear that this doesn't mean that we give uncritical support to the Zelensky government. Ukrainian workers, trade unionists, feminists, so the social movements there in many different forms are fighting on two fronts. First of all, against the Russian invasion. As Tanya made clear, I mean, you can't separate that from any other issue in Ukraine, but also against their own government's neoliberal policies, which we can talk about further later. So our solidarity is also about supporting the independent organizing that's been happening in Ukraine. We've been building connections to that, and we've been building connections with the labor movement there and other progressive organizations, feminists, other social justice movements. And we're trying to link them with their counterpart organizations in the United States. And we made some progress. That's represented by the solidarity effort that we and others have been organizing to support the Ukrainian nurses union, and we received significant engagement from particularly nurses unions, but other unions as well. In my view, well, not just my view, I mean, the reality is that the Ukrainians are fighting a war of self-defense. It's a war of survival as a nation, as a culture. We support this war of resistance and their right to determine the means and the material objectives of their struggle, their right to self-determination, and the material capacity to exercise those rights. And this is where it gets controversial sometimes on the left in this country. That includes their right to obtain the weapons they need from any available source. That doesn't mean that we support NATO. We don't. And we don't have any illusions about what the U.S. or other Western governments, their ruling classes, what their real geopolitical interests and intentions are. No illusions in that. We also think it's important to demand the cancellation of Ukraine's debts to all of these international financial institutions. To rebuild Ukraine is going to take a lot of resources. I mean, I don't know if anyone knows, but I mean, Ukraine has been devastated. I want to talk a little bit about the Ukrainian nurses and the healthcare workers. They've been facing an excruciating working conditions, long hours for years and years now, with inadequate, essential life-saving equipment for their hospitals. And our Labor Council, concretely, we're giving support in terms of dollars, along with other unions, in supporting the fundraising drive. And there's literature here on that. For Be Like We Are, that's a movement of it encompasses the Ukrainian Nurses Union to help them purchase medical equipment for frontline hospitals. And I urge you to check out and see the flyers and to make a contribution, or most importantly, to bring it to your organizations, to your unions, to your political organizations, whatever. So we're demanding, with no illusions about our ability to make an impact on this Trump administration, but a permanent ceasefire, withdrawal of all Russian forces, Yes, diplomatic negotiations. There eventually will be negotiations, as there are in all wars, but ones that respect Ukrainian sovereignty and can attempt to win a just and lasting peace for this country. That's obviously not an easy objective. Compromises are probably going to be made, but it's not for us in our organizations in this country to tell them what concessions they need to make. That's for the Ukrainians themselves to decide. If they have to make concessions, they're the ones that make those decisions. They have to be at the bargaining table. It's not a deal between Trump and Putin, signed onto by leaders of some Western capitalist countries. That's not the negotiated peace that any of us should be supporting. You know, the reality of these negotiations and that of the Putin regime is they're working together to try to impose a robber's peace. I'd call it a peace of the graveyard. That's the kind of peace that they're pushing towards, and they have a lot of leverage. I mean, frankly, Ukrainians who are fighting need those weapons, and there's a lot of leverage. They're vulnerable. You know, there's a principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and that's something we have to honor and fight for. That means everyone, including those on the left, have to be clear that these decisions, well, first of all, what you might have heard on the news tonight or what you were reading in the newspapers, I mean, it's all a pipe dream about peace just by Christmas. It's not going to happen. Putin's not going to go along with it. Whatever pressure Trump puts on the Ukrainians, I mean, simply because of the sentiment of the Ukrainian people, as well as other things like their constitution, they cannot and will not go along with the Putin-Trump solution, so-called solution to this war. So the Ukrainian, it's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. The Ukrainian working class, they deserve better from us, and so do the Russian anti-war activists who are in prison or facing prison for opposing Putin's war. This is a time for working class solidarity. Like we need to rebuild an international working class movement that puts solidarity, real solidarity, into our daily actions. And this means solidarity with Ukraine against Russian imperialism and the Trump administration. There was a poll, a fairly rigorous poll done recently, and just a lot of people are saying, well, Ukrainians are tired of the war. Well, of course they're tired of the war. Yeah. They've been dying in huge numbers. They've been sacrificing, as you've heard from Tanya. But I'm just going to read this. The latest version of the Russian peace plan, including the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donbass, that's rejected by 75% of Ukrainians. Yeah. I think something like 17% are willing to accept that plan, but 75% are opposed to it. If such a plan is implemented, 65% of them will consider it as a defeat for Ukraine. And 69% of Ukrainians expect Russia will try to attack again. Well, that's a certainty. I mean, that is, if there's a ceasefire, and yes, we should support a ceasefire. But that ceasefire, it's only going to be preparation for the next war. At the same time, 74% of Ukrainians, without enthusiasm, they're ready to support a peace plan between Europe and Ukraine, which includes a freeze behind the current front lines, without any legal recognition, and with the Ukrainians receiving real security guarantees. 62% of Ukrainians are ready to endure war as long as necessary. That number has actually grown since June of 2025, when it was somewhat lower. It was 60%. So that tells you something about the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people. And I just spoke very briefly, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
I just want to add that we know from what we have seen in Palestine that occupation isn't peace. I spoke to people who fled Crimea because of how horrific the conditions are, particularly for the native Crimean Tatars. I've also spoken to people who have fled the Donbass region because of how horrific the conditions are there. For every one Ukrainian that is left in an occupied space, it's not peace for them. And it is a certainty. The peace plan in 2014 was fine as long as you don't go further than the land you've already taken. And yet here we are, 11 years later, nearly 4 years into a war where Russia has said, actually, you let us do it once, why wouldn't you let us do it again? And the 1991 borders of Ukraine were agreed upon by Russia, the United States, Ukraine. They were agreed upon. And Ukraine then gave up their nuclear weapons with a guarantee of those being protected. So I don't think we can trust any guarantee that's put on paper that doesn't, frankly, come from a Russian military defeat.
All right. I wanted to read the statement from the Ukrainian Nurses Union, Be Like We Are. They sent this specifically for our meeting here in Vermont. They write, "We are an organization of the medical movement that emerged from the grassroots and consists mostly of ordinary working people, nurses and healthcare workers. We remain in Ukraine and fight for the health of our patients. Of course, we defend, promote, and support the struggle for the rights to decent work. But above all, this is a fight for health, a fight for every human life. Everyone understands the conditions under which we must overcome obstacles every day, starting with sleepless, cold nights under shelling, the journey to work, caring for the functioning of medical institutions, facing the challenges of patients suffering, and ensuring the survival of our own families. We are deeply grateful for international support. Thanks to you, we are alive, and that is the truth. Despite the slow actions of those in power, we unite and act. We act in a targeted way, going where help is needed now, and thus we give people hope for the future. We must hold on and endure, no matter how hard it is. The fundraising for a blood biochemistry analyzer and its future purchase will be able to save thousands of lives of residents of the frontline areas of the Chernihiv region, because recovery depends on fast and high-quality diagnostics. We travel to these hospitals and provide care to a very large number of people who find it difficult to reach larger cities, whose lives depend on timely diagnosis and assistance. Among the patients, there are many children who require rapid action. However, the equipment in such hospitals can be 20 to 30 years old. This is a very serious problem. We sincerely thank you for your donations and kindness. We understand that these are difficult times for everyone, but believe us, you are doing a very important thing. You are influencing the saving of lives and the future of people, a living Ukraine." All right. With that, we'll open it up to comments, questions, and the floor is open. Just raise your hand and I'll take a speaker's list in order.
I've never seen.
Go ahead, Ken.
Trey's speechless.
Tanya, you mentioned talking to and sort of witnessing grassroots efforts on the leftist side, but I wonder if there's any sort of lessons that you picked up there that you think we could use here in Vermont and in the States to sort of empower more grassroots efforts.
I mean, it's hard. Yes. I mean, I think we have to find a way to come together across difference. That was the thing that was so striking to me as to how people could really stand up in the face of existential crisis and continue to fight a leftist movement inside a country at war was the unity. And, there also are the union movement. It's different because there's sort of two different unions. There's the Federated Union, which is sort of a remnant of the Soviet times, and then there's the Free Trade Union movement. And there's friction between these two unions. And it was very interesting to speak to union leaders from both and to hear them acknowledge that friction is important because it allows the free union to push in ways that the Federated Union can't, and the Federated Union to get resources that the free union can't, and that there's actually value in that friction. And that the union movements travel all the way into the schools. The university students are organized, and university students are part of unions. And so I think we need to do a lot more union organizing. And we need to find ways to unify and recognize that we have so much more in common as working people than we don't, and that we bring people along when we're able to show them what we have to offer and a direction that makes sense to them, and acknowledge that, yes, there can be friction, but it has to be humane, and it has to be open to change and open to where things are different. But I think that space within those two unions was just a really powerful moment for me, where I recognized the power in the friction between them. And I think a lot of times in the United States and in Vermont as well, we get very siloed into our issue. And that's the issue that we hyper-focus on, and we forget about all the other issues, and the fact that all those other issues are actually all woven together in the larger struggle against oligarchy. And I didn't see that as much. When I was with the environmentalists, they would reference, well, the feminists are doing this, you should meet them and you should talk to them, and here's how we're working together. And when I was with the feminists and they were talking about how they've pivoted a little bit from some of the work they'd historically done to really focusing more on the LGBTQ movement because it's much more in the forefront and needed now, the flexibility and the willingness to step outside of, I just didn't see the silos the way that we do here. So I think breaking down those silos and unifying more across issue is really important, and will help us to grow a bigger, more functional opposition.
List is open for other comments, questions.
This is the most silent I've ever heard a group of leftists.
I'm honestly wondering whether or not that Ukraine will have the means at all to defend itself indefinitely, considering that the collective West does not have the industrial capacity, neither the resource riches that Russia has to wage this war. Russia has leverage. We don't.
So I don't think anyone expected Ukraine to hold their own as long as they have. And the Ukrainians are incredibly industrious people, and have always been. I'm going to tell a historical story and then get to the present. But as the USSR was getting closer and closer to collapse, they were doing subway projects in all of the big cities. And Kryvyi Rih, which is a city that I visited, this is the city where students are studying in bomb shelters. It's about at the time I was there, it was about 60 kilometers from the front lines, which, if my math is right, is about 35 miles. But it's the rail hub and the metal ore hub, so it gets struck pretty frequently. They were not deemed large enough for a subway. And the Ukrainians were like, well, but we need a subway. And so they scavenged parts off of trolley cars and subways, and they gathered them all together, dug their own tunnels, and built what I believe is the only underground trolley car in the world. And it's a testament to the industriousness. And we've actually seen that throughout this war with the drone research that is now cutting edge and leading the world. Dnipro was actually the space hub of the USSR. Most of the aerospace technology that was used in the USSR space race came out of Ukraine, which is part of why they have the drone technology and that capacity that they do. But Ukraine is often painted as this poor, rural, backwoods farming country. And there is a lot of agriculture in Ukraine. It is the breadbasket of Europe, but there is also a lot of incredible scientists, incredible minds. And Russia's economy is collapsing. They are struggling to provide fuel to heat their people's homes. This war is starting to impact everyday Russian people. I don't think Russia has as much leverage as we think they do.
I'll just add to that I think you can't approach this question in an abstract way, like who's got more X, Y, or Z. I think you got to approach it much more politically and concretely. Which side are you on? Are you on the side of Russian imperial aggression, which has invaded, occupied, colonized, and dispossessed and destroyed whole sections of Ukraine, including mass rape including mass theft of children. Tens of thousands of children have been sent to concentration camps in Russia to be re-educated, and many of them sold up for adoption to Russian parents. This is a kind of cultural genocide that cannot be exaggerated. So that's the reality of the situation. And the real question is, which side are you on in that? And what we in the Ukraine Solidarity Network is saying, we're full stop on the side of Ukraine's fight for self-determination. That has to be the beginning point. And then, as Traven said, it's up to Ukraine to determine the terms on which any ceasefire happens, any negotiated peace, anything happens. That's the basic democratic right of self-determination. The other thing to say is what Tanya referred to. Everybody thought Ukraine was going to fall in the first 2 weeks of the invasion. And in fact, the US and NATO advised Zelensky to flee. And what Ukraine showed is its fighting capacity, immediately paralyzing the Russian invasion, stopping it, and then pushing it way back. And essentially the front lines have been frozen for the last 2 years. There's little movement this way or that way, but they've been essentially frozen. The real problem has been the reluctance of the US and the NATO countries to adequately supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs for self-defense. There's been a drip, drip, drip approach by the US and NATO because their ambitions are to weaken Russia. Their ambitions are not for a free and sovereign Ukraine in the end. So they've played it safe on their terms. And I think Tanya's absolutely right. It is a question of time before the Russian regime. Remember why Russia invaded. It was not about NATO. Mainly, it was about the revolutionary uprisings that have been sweeping Eastern Europe that are a threat to the regime in Russia. That is, because if there's examples of democratic uprisings that win self-determination in Russia's former sphere of influence, its former empire, then it's a threat to the regime. Remember what was going on. There was a mass pro-democracy movement against Putin in Russia that he had to crush, and he looked at what was happening in the region as a threat that would inspire an internal opposition. That's why he's turned Russia into a giant prison camp of any dissident. That's why it's illegal to read Marxism in Russia. They just jailed 12 students for having a study group on Lenin's theory of the national question. So this is their paranoia. They've jailed some of the best intellectuals. They've driven hundreds of thousands of the most gifted people out of the country into exile, into Europe and throughout the rest of the world. Many of those people, Tanya and I and Traven, collaborate in the Ukraine Solidarity Movement. People like Ilya Budraitskis or Ilya Matveev, and we can go through numerous names of famous public intellectuals who are now in exile in opposition to the regime. The war economy at some point is going to produce contradictions internally to Russia. There is a de facto poverty draft. Where are these soldiers coming from in Russia? Just like the poverty draft in the United States, disproportionately racialized, nationally oppressed minorities within Russia. There's going to be a certain point where the tolerance of the meat grinder of this war, which Russia basically throws all its soldiers to die in the war. Eventually that will rebound back at home, just like it has under US imperialism during the Vietnam War, when the sacrifice of US soldiers rebounded into inflaming a domestic opposition in the United States. The same dynamic is at work in Russia. That's why in the Ukraine Solidarity Movement, we try to build bridges of solidarity with the Russian anti-war resistance inside Russia, because they are the democratic force that builds a bridge between us, Russian workers, and Ukrainian workers to fight for a genuine alternative within Europe, but also more broadly and internationally. Sorry, I went on too long, but
that's okay. I also think it's really important to your point about Europe and the United States with their drip, drip, drip effect. There are billions, tens of billions of dollars in frozen Russian assets that could be released, even just the interest on those frozen Russian assets that could be released immediately to help give Ukraine the ability to issue a military defeat. And we're simply not doing it. But in that time, Ukraine has developed their own long-range missiles, has developed... And I think the difference when you're... And I felt it. I mean, I've not visited Russia. I don't know that I'd be very welcome there. But the people going to the front lines, not every single one of them, but many of the people going to the front lines in Ukraine are choosing to be there because they're fighting for their existential freedom.
Right.
That is very different than just being sent into the meat grinder. And even per capita, the Russian losses are astronomically larger than the Ukrainian losses. And that is not to say, like I said, conscription is happening in Ukraine, and it is happening in an unfair way, like it does everywhere. But many of the people that I spoke to, whether it was Maxim Butkovich, whether it was, my friend Vladislav that I spoke to earlier today, they chose. They got up and said, I am going to go fight for my country's freedom. And I think there is a different push when that's the fight than when it is simply my country told me I have to do this because some guy who lives underground that I never see decided we had to do a war.
Helen?
This is it's very moving hearing you all speak, and it's also very informative because so much of this has just dropped out of the public discourse in this country. But I was just thinking that everything that you're saying, it's all stuff that resonates with union members in this country. And I actually remember at the beginning of this latest Russian invasion, many of my colleagues, I'm in the faculty union at UVM, many of my colleagues were saying, the only thing I can think about is Ukraine. There was an instinctive sense, this is a great injustice. It's an empire just out of the blue, seemingly, bombing and attacking the people. And it's only got worse, but it has dropped down of public discourse. So, for this event, some of us were able to, United Academics, to endorse this panel, and they said gladly. I wonder if any of you can speak about some of the unions that have done more than just sign on, but actually given donations, what that process has looked like, how members of unions have managed to make this an issue and force and presumably that's how it's happened. But I would be curious if you've got any stories about how some of those best unions have come to the point where they're donating.
I'm thinking right off about nurses unions, like the National Nurses United, which is the largest organization of nurses across the country. I know they've taken a very strong stand. I actually don't know whether they've actually contributed dollars to. They have. Okay. There certainly are other unions across the country that have been donating money to help the Ukrainian Nurses Union. A lot more is needed. This is an issue which should be taken into every union. Some unions, like the electrical workers, you don't think of. The IBEW, is not always thought of as like the most, class conscious union, but certainly, there are democratic elements, far-seeing elements within it that have taken a stand and raised funds. I know some CWA, Communication Workers of America unions, and others have taken a stand and donated money. I don't have a complete list. I don't know the complete list. But
I can dig it up, the complete list of unions that have donated. But I did want to tell the story about Trisha. I don't know. I'm going to bastardize her last name. I don't know if you know how to pronounce that. Rishkush.
That's how I would say it.
Okay, good. I got Tanya's approval, so it's good. She's a member of the local chapter of the National Nurses United in Minneapolis, and she brought it to her e-board meeting. She's an elected representative, and they had a whole debate discussion about the fundraising campaign, about its significance, about the whole war, the Ukrainian Nurses Union, and they had a vote. She won the vote. They've given $1,000. I think it's $500 or $1,000 to the campaign. And there's similar processes like that are unfolding in many different unions that we hoped out of tonight that we could open the doors to VFNHP to do the same kind of thing, to United Academics to do the same thing, to Green Mountain Labor Council is another way that we can open that discussion. But one thing to share with people who aren't here tonight is we're going to have a panel on Haymarket's YouTube channel on this Wednesday at 3:00, and there will be a live Ukrainian nurse who's going to be speaking from the front line, Oksana Slobodiana, and she's one of the elected leaders of Be Like We Are. I don't know if you had a chance to meet with her, but she's going to be speaking, as well as Pavlo Smirnov, who's one of the national leaders in Ukraine of the harm reduction movement. And so they'll talk about it and put it in very personal, immediate terms, as well as Denis Bondar, who's a very well-known Ukrainian activist here in the United States, as well as Trisha Rishkus. So the four of them will be talking, and I think that would be good to share with the unions in Vermont, including the Vermont AFL-CIO, to put the question to the Vermont labor movement. And one thing that I think is, Tanya referred to it, but I think it's important to underline, is that this is a fight against the authoritarian right globally. Look at Trump's new national security strategy. What does that say about Europe? It says the problem in Europe is these liberal democratic parties are preventing the rise of far-right parties, many of which are supported by Putin's Russia. And Trump and Putin are jointly collaborating in the supporting of the rise of the far right within Europe. This is a conscious plan by Putin with lots of financial connections, and Trump is now greenlighting the same thing. So what that does is it binds our opposition to domestic far-right authoritarianism in the United States against the Trump administration to the same project against the Russian regime, and that requires solidarity with Ukraine. It all works together. And I think that's one thing that I want to underline in this meeting, is that we have to have solidarity with the oppressed without exception and in all circumstances. And there's far too much selective solidarity. I'm with Palestine, not with Ukraine. I'm with Ukraine, not Palestine. That methodology is a disaster for a genuine internationalist left. And so what we're trying to present is a whole different methodology that genuinely, it's workers of the world unite, or we're going to lose to the far right.
I also have spent some time actually working, a fair amount of time, maybe more time than I've spent working domestically, with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in Western Europe. And they have gone union by union. And even when they lose the argument or lose the vote, they just go back and do it again. And they have brought a lot of unions on. I'm a little bit more familiar with the process in the UK, but sort of across Western Europe, there are people that are sort of, and they're doing exactly what you said. Mm-hmm. They're going union by union and calling the vote. And they've done a lot of good work there, and I'm sure would be happy to talk to you or really anyone about what their strategy has been. But I know they've brought public workers, teachers, all kinds of different unions on to being in this coalition of support for the fight for Ukrainian sovereignty. And, you know, I think to your point that early on everyone was talking about it, the very cynical side of me, we did a rally at the State House. Peter Welch was there. Bernie sent someone. The governor came I think it was April of 2022. Mm-hmm. And one of the people that had really wanted to do something later, I was like, we have to do it now because people are going to stop talking about it later. And I wished I'd been wrong. Yeah. But I think it's also important that we don't stop talking about Ukraine, that we continue to do things and continue to try and fill all the seats in this room and take that message out so that people have a real sense of what is happening and how critically important it is to sort of this worldwide democracy that we stand with Ukraine. Mm-hmm.
Other questions, comments? Go ahead, Tristan.
Yeah, again, this has been super, super helpful. And I think that what all of you have said as far as like framing this or understanding this in terms of a global fight against the right is really helpful when I think about like the recent Chilean elections, right, and the rise of the far right in Latin America as well. But these people are all talking to each other.
Yes, they are.
You know, like the platform that the newly elected Chilean president ran on was just, I mean, it was taken out of Trump's playbook.
Big time.
And so our side has to do the same in kind, right? Like learning from the tactics and solidarity of our movement. And I'm just like, Traven, the numbers that you concluded with were unbelievable, right? Yeah. That number of people would be willing to continue fighting after everything that they've been through is incredibly inspiring. It makes what we do here seem small by comparison. And to that end, I was wondering, Tanya, if you could talk more about what you refer to as like horrific conditions in occupied sections of the Ukraine, because I feel like I'm not as familiar with that. And it's also just an important thing I think for us to keep in mind in terms of the cost of this, because even if the Ukraine were to agree to, terrible compromise right now, it means that Russia would come for more and more
Exactly.
sections of the country would
Yep.
look like the occupied sections of the country right now.
Yeah, I mean, some of the most horrific things have been some of the stories coming out of Kherson about, they call them safaris, where they're literally just going down the street shooting civilians in the streets. In parts of Donbass, there's no running water. The Crimean Tatars have been horrifically oppressed and driven out of their native land. Torture, concentration camps. Again, many of the kidnapped children, and the last numbers I knew was well over 20,000 children. Many of them have been taken from those occupied regions, sent to concentration camps to be Russified or re-educated and then adopted out to, it's mass graves, horrific sexual abuse. It's awful. It's genocidal, really. A lot of people didn't want to talk about it. Some people would share little bits, but they're generally, you have to piece together because one person will share, well, this happened to me, and the next person, but what the picture that is painted is not that different than what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah.
Certainly that's not what it looked like in Kyiv, but that is what it looks like in the occupied regions. And I think the other, thing that, and it's a classic Russian tactic, is that the Russians focus a lot of their shelling and bombing and drone strikes on civilian infrastructure rather than military targets, which at least in Ukraine seems to have the opposite of the desired effect. The desired effect is they'll give up, but it does not. These numbers from my conversation in August and these numbers now that it's rising, the opposition doesn't surprise me at all. I visited a park in Kryvyi Rih that in April, so this park, I have a video if people want to see it, but sits in the center of Kryvyi Rih. And here there's a children's school. And here there's an apartment block. And here there's a restaurant. And here there's essentially a convenience store. No military target anywhere nearby. Couldn't possibly be considered an accident. And in early April on a Friday evening, Russia hit that park with cluster munitions, which are a war crime no matter where you use them. And they killed 19 people, including 8 children. And that park has become a shrine. There's stuffed animals. And I visited that park and it was pretty moving. It's the first time in my life I've been to a war crime. But that's the type of thing that Russia is doing. They hit hospitals. They hit apartment blocks. They're not, yes, occasionally they're hitting military targets as well. But they are targeting civilian infrastructure. And what that has done actually is make the Ukrainians even angrier and even more resolute in that Russia cannot be allowed to occupy Ukraine. And none of the leftists that I spoke to would argue that the Ukrainian government is a leftist government, but there are exactly 0 far-right people elected in that government. There are no Nazis. That is Russian propaganda. There are probably Nazis in Ukraine. There's Nazis everywhere. But none of them have been elected, and they certainly haven't been elected to the White House. But what is also very true, as I said earlier, occupation isn't peace for the people in occupied lands. It isn't a lasting peace. It's a pause button for Russia to regroup and come back for more. And there's no leftist Ukrainian future under Russian occupation. No, yeah, absolutely. Zelensky's government is a center neoliberal government. But it doesn't go further to the left if Russia is occupying that government. And it doesn't get better for the people who are currently living under the conditions they're living under in those occupied regions. And a member of the military and I were speaking, and he was quite clear that so I was in Ukraine during the August negotiations, and he was very clear with me that if the Ukrainian government accepted what was on the table, that there would be revolts in the military because that is not what they were fighting for.
Yep.
Let me ask a question. My perception is that unless Putin is actually able to accomplish much of what he set out to do at this stage, my assumption is this is just a stage, and then it'll be more of Ukraine, then it'll be more of Poland, then it'll be more of et cetera, which is why NATO has been growing. I mean, Putin's the greatest organizer for expanding NATO, Finland, et cetera, et cetera. Is that Putin's government, his regime, would collapse if they don't secure what they can consider a tremendous victory over Ukraine.
Yeah.
I mean, just the suffering of the Russian people is so massive. The number of deaths, the impact on the economy, everything else, that this is a life and death question for Putin and his regime too, which makes any kind of illusions that the negotiations that are happening in Germany now and Trump's promise that this will all be solved by Christmas. I mean, what?
Yeah.
Am I just too cynical, or?
I don't think you are too cynical, and I actually think in some ways you're not cynical enough. And here's where I'll say that is you've made the assumption that this is just the first stage, but members of the Putin administration have publicly said that even if Ukraine, the country, is wiped off the map, there will be no peace until Ukrainians are wiped off the map. They are not, they have made very clear that their goal is to eliminate Ukrainian history, culture, and people. They have said it publicly.
Yeah.
Sounds a lot like Gaza to me. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And if people think that's exaggeration, people should watch the documentary about Mariupol. Watch it, because this is what Russia is doing to the cities that is attacking and puts under occupation. We saw it in Bucha, mass rapes, mass killing. Mariupol, they literally flattened a mass city and with hundreds of thousands of people forced to flee. People should then watch what they're doing in the reconstruction of Mariupol. They are banning the Ukrainian language, Russifying the entire public school system, forcing people to learn Russian history, not Ukrainian history. Anybody who dissents with that is whisked off the streets and put into jails. That's what it's like to live under occupation, under reconstruction. The best possible terms is Russification. So what Tanya's saying about the elimination of the Ukrainian people as a nation, as a people with a long history and their own language, that is being criminalized and denied a people. And people are right to make the reference to Palestine. This is what Israel does in Palestine. Even more brutal, as we've seen. But this is the ambition of Russia inside Ukraine. And if people should have no illusions about Russian speakers in Ukraine. Russian speakers in Ukraine support Ukraine against Russia, because if you look at the conditions in Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russia has occupied since 2014, it's horrific and terrible for Russian speakers because you're living under an autocracy. Look at Russian speakers in Russia. There's no right to organize. There's no right to protest. There's no free trade unions. You're under a police state. And if you dissent, you're shipped off like Boris Kagarlitsky to a gulag, because anything that challenges the Russian regime is a threat. We should remember how fragile this regime is. Just a year and a half ago, they were nearly toppled in a military coup led by a general that was part of Putin's inner circle. They led a military offensive against Moscow. That's how dangerous and fragile the Putin regime is. And I just want to say one other thing about the intelligence of the Ukrainian people, because we live in a fog in the United States. The Ukrainian people see through the fog. And I just want to give a more of the opinion polls that have come out that Traven referred to. So 72% of Ukrainians approve a peace plan. At the same time, 75% reject a plan that would, among other things, include the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donbass, restrictions of the size of Ukraine's army, at the same time would not contain specific security guarantees. 9% of Ukrainians expect the war to end by the beginning of 2026. 9%. Nobody believes in these peace negotiations. 63% are ready to endure war as long as necessary to win for Ukraine. 49% trust the European Union. Then list about the United States. Belief in the United States has decreased from 41% a year ago to 21% now.
Why is it that high?
Well, they're actually smarter than American civilians, because American civilians still approve the Trump administration with what, 50 some percent, or no, it's
We're in the 40s.
No, it's in the 40s. Yeah, I forget the latest figures. The low is 36%. Its average is 42%. So Ukrainians are smarter on Trump than people in the United States. Trust in NATO has dropped from 43% to 34%. And then domestically, this is important because Trump is talking about this unelected leader, Zelensky, blah, blah, blah. He's ruling through autocracy. Funny thing to think what Trump is saying about who's an autocrat when he promised to be a dictator day one. 61% of Ukrainians trust President Zelensky. 32% do not trust him. Early October, 60% trusted him, 35% did not trust him. So you can see there continues to be support for this government, even with all its corruption. Why? Because Zelensky is a leader de facto of the struggle for Ukrainian self-determination. Pox and all, problems and all. That's what the Ukrainian people recognize. That's why Trump wants to take down Zelensky. Mm-hmm. It's important to understand that. We defend the right of Ukraine to determine its own leadership, not Donald Trump and certainly not Vladimir Putin.
I don't know if this is the same. I have two things, one to add to this and one to sort of take a step back, but I don't know if this is the same poll that was done, but there was a poll done at some point in the not too distant past that sussed out the Zelensky support and basically asked if people supported him as the leader now during the war as a war leader.
Yeah.
And it was this overwhelming yes. And then there was another question asked, after the war is over, would you still support Zelensky to lead the country?
That's right.
And the numbers dropped into the 30s or 40s. They're able to suss out, this is the leader we need now, right now, fighting for our sovereignty. And afterwards, we want something different.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the language. So Russia has banned the Ukrainian language a lot in the past. And actually part of the reason that there are so many Russian-speaking Ukrainians, some of them come from Russia, but some of them are because it was only within the last 30 years that Ukrainians were allowed to learn Ukrainian in school. When I took a document with me to Ukraine to hand off to a friend of mine there who was going to help me do some of this family history research, and the picture peeled off of it, it was a Red Cross document from when my grandfather was fleeing. And my friend says, Tanya, I think your grandfather spoke native Ukrainian. And I said, no, I know he did. He was, that's very strange for the time. Mm. And the way he knew that is because the Cyrillic is different. Russian Cyrillic and Ukrainian Cyrillic is different. And there was writing on the back of the picture. But because of the time, he thought it was very strange that my grandfather spoke Ukrainian. He also spoke Russian and Polish and 6 other languages, but his native language was Ukrainian. And that's actually what led us down looking into the declassified Soviet files of Ukrainian independence fighters to find his information. That little snippet of, oh, he spoke Ukrainian? That's weird.
We've been talking a lot. Of any questions, comments, disagreements? Things are fine. Paul, go ahead.
Actually referred to this earlier. One thing we saw in 2022 when the U.S. was withdrawing its diplomatic corps and expecting a quick defeat was just the mass popular uprising against the invasion and against the occupation, right? So this is kind of the lesson of the 20th century is why occupations don't work. It's because they catalyze mass opposition and eventually become untenable, So the response or the realization is mass destruction of the society. That's what Israel is doing to Palestinians. You can eliminate the resistance by eliminating that's clearly the goal. And when Putin advertised going in to reestablish Greater Russia, right? Clearly that was the aim. The other thing about ethno-nationalism, kind of expressed through the great empires or so the great powers, Trump and Putin have an interest in great powers having recognized spheres of influence. And Trump wants all the Americas, Greenland,
Canada,
The big
Arctic,
Americas.
and Canada,
All the
the
Americas.
entitled America. And to the extent that that's accepted in the norm, and you have kind of agreeable, authoritarians in South America agreeing to that framework, that's Greater Russia. That's kind of agreement among the great powers to distribute the world, right? So any kind of fight against that anywhere in the world is a chink in the armor of that. The last thing I wanted to ask you, kind of one thing you said, Tanya, early on is your conversation about the response being the war affects everything. I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that in the terms of, what's still impressive is kind of from what you're describing is this the mass struggle element of the resistance. And so I don't know, you may not have any kind of more thoughts on this, but there is this question around, how to, you brought it up several times, how to unify, and kind of any more thoughts on how the occupation and the war does that in Ukraine?
I mean, I think to some extent, occupation and war, and you just made this point, sort of help with that unification. You have an external enemy. You don't have time for internal enemies. And I certainly heard that. It was actually talking to the same feminist in Lviv. And Lviv is a fairly large, a little bit more Western influenced city, but it's fairly well known as the most conservative part of Ukraine. And that was weird to me because I'm used to our metropolitan areas being the least conservative parts of where we are. And so I asked why. And the answer was sort of complex and, who is moving there, who is living there. A lot of the internally displaced people sort of creating, because a lot of internally displaced Ukrainians have gone to Lviv. So it's been quickly growing. There's a lot of unrest in that housing. There's not enough housing stock. But then, the counter that I asked, where are the most progressive pockets of Ukraine? And the answer was the front lines.
Yeah.
Because they're closer to the external enemy and they don't have time for that battle within. There was another point in time where Ukraine largely relies on nuclear power and has done incredible research into really safe, compacted nuclear power. Well, and this was interesting to me as I was like, okay, if anywhere in the world was going to be really skeptical about nuclear power, I would expect it to be Ukraine. And so I asked, how did that come about? And the answer was, it's incredibly inexpensive. And when Russia led a full-scale invasion, we lost access to petrochemicals. We didn't have time to build solar. So we did what we had to do. And people came, so it's a lot of that sort of unity and that shift in thinking, yes, is because of the war. I sort of was like, okay, so what you're telling me is if I'm going to get leftist unity, I need Canada to invade? That's not super helpful. But I also think there's a maturity to the leftists in Ukraine. They've been around fighting against, for freedom and fighting for this movement for a really long time. I mean, the Ukrainian People's Republic, it was arguably one of the first, if not the first, truly organized leftist republics. And that was in the early 19-teens.
Under Nestor?
No.
And was really dismantled by the Bolsheviks. So it's not a new thing for this leftist movement to be pushing against authoritarian imperialism. So my hope is that our new imperial authoritarians will force leftists to unify more, because I do think that in some ways existential crisis is what forces people together. But I also think that one of the big stumbling blocks for the United States that we have to unpack and we have to figure out, even in leftist circles, is the individualistic nature of our society. Ukrainian society is just not that individualistic. Very much, it just in its core is how can I take care of somebody else? Maybe I don't have enough, but I also want to care for you. I mean, again, what my experience the entire time was. And when people are asking questions, in your question too, I am sure that some of my fellow leftists in Ukraine would be more than happy to come onto a Zoom with us and talk this out and see if they can offer us thoughts for how to move forward that I don't have. Because not a single one of them didn't offer that to me and doesn't continue to offer that to me on a regular basis, even when they're in the midst of a rolling blackout or they spent the night in the subway last night because their apartment building was being shelled. They are regularly saying, well, what do you need from us? How can we help support you to make this movement? And in some ways, I think that's because they understand the need for global solidarity in the face of global fascism. But in other ways, I think that they're truly just at their core a more communal society. And I don't know how, if I have figured out how to make my fellow Vermonters, my fellow in large, fellow Americans genuinely care about one another, a lot of the things that I fight for and beat my head against the wall for in the State House wouldn't be an issue. We would have universal health care. There wouldn't be children starving in the streets of Burlington.
Maybe we have final comments from Traven and Tanya, if you have any concluding things, and then I just make a couple announcements. Traven?
Well, my concluding ask is that people actually check out the holiday effort for the nurses, and to, if you can make a contribution, but take it to your organizations, or to your unions, or whatever. I actually have a question. I mean, this is maybe really in the weeds, but given that there are independent trade unions, given that there's a tradition of anarchism on the left in Ukraine, which is understandable given what people's experience has been with so-called communism, that is to say Stalinism, and even some of the really not great things that happened even under the Bolsheviks. That actually Lenin, I remember, attacked Stalin for being a great Russian chauvinist over this issue. To what degree is it possible to have independent self-organization during this war? Or even, is that a perspective? We on the far left in this country during World War II, some of us were advocating, I'm not quite that old, but I'm close to it. We had something called a proletarian military policy, which is the notion that, working class people, we want to fight fascism. We want to fight Nazism, but we also want to fight our own bosses. Given the attacks of the Zelensky regime on unions and other social movements, do we see that possibility is that a perspective of building independently, including, you mentioned the most progressive attitudes are on the front lines within the military effort? Or is that just fantasy?
I don't think it is. And I think if you take some really deep dives into Ukraine's past, they've had glimmers of this before. I mean, they had an independent military fighting for Ukrainian freedom during World War II. They weren't fighting for the Russians or the Nazis. They were fighting for Ukrainian independence. And that was largely working class. And I had no idea, in spite of the more history than I think a lot of people have about Ukraine, I didn't even know of this entity's existence until I discovered my grandfather fought in it. But I think there's been glimmers of it in the past, and I think there's a cohesiveness there that could come again. I mean, I met with anarchists too, and they work in conjunction with the people, the leftists and the academics and the free trade unions, and when necessary, the federated trade unions. So I think it is possible. And I think in some ways it's already happening. I mean, yes, Zelensky's government has come for a lot of things, and the people have fought back. Sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. But the fact that they're even fighting back and winning is more than I'm seeing here right now. So I think it is. I don't think it's a pipe dream.
Great. Do you have anything else?
I think I want to really close with just, yes, please take a flyer. Please, if you can, donate to the nurses union. And even more importantly, don't stop talking about Ukraine. thank you for coming and hearing and being open to a different understanding. And just, we can't stop talking about it. We have to recognize that what happens to Ukrainians is going to happen to all of us.
I'll just say a couple of things and then make an announcement. So I think what Tanya said is extremely important. I want to underline it because I think there have been two wars that have occupied the conscience and consciousness of the people of the world for the last 3 and 4 years. And that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Israel's US-backed genocide in Palestine. And those are really the pivotal issues around which a new left globally is going to be born or stymied. Those who can put it together are going to be able to put together a genuine internationalist left that practices solidarity without exception. I really want to encourage people to go to the Ukraine Solidarity Network website and look at the resources because many people know nothing about Ukraine, to be honest, in the United States. Even if they have a gut level in sympathy with Ukraine, there's not a knowledge of the depth of the history of the Ukrainian fight for self-determination over the long haul, and especially since 2014 and 2022. And I encourage people to read, in particular, Yulia Yurchenko's book, Ukraine and the Empire of Capital, which is the most thorough analysis of Ukraine's position in European capitalism and really global capitalism. And just on the question of class consciousness in Ukraine, because that's essentially what you're raising, Traven, I think that we have to remember that Ukrainians keep overthrowing their own governments. I mean, there is a high level of class consciousness about the oligarchic nature of the regime that is in charge of Ukraine, and that people, when they're dissatisfied with those regimes, no matter how they came to power, appointed or elected, they overthrow them. That's what Putin is terrified in Ukraine, is that there's this independent struggle to shape your own destiny that the Ukrainian people keep rediscovering. And the war, despite all the horrors, that is still alive. And what Tanya referred to as what the soldiers said, if Zelensky agrees to something they don't support, they'll overthrow Zelensky. That's deep in the consciousness of the people of Ukraine because they're fighting for their own liberation, not for the Zelensky government. And that's important to understand. That's why the Ukraine Solidarity Network has consciously built ties of solidarity with the Ukrainian left, Socialny Ruch in particular, but also the anarchist left. We've got several anarchists who are part of the Ukraine Solidarity Network, including Trisha from the Minneapolis Nurses Union. She's an organized anarchist and has played an important role in the work in the unions. And we've also built deep relations with the independent trade unions, in particular in Ukraine, and with people on the front lines. Taras Bilus is an important person that we've had speak at the Ukraine Solidarity Network, and he's part of the progressive left in the front lines, as well as with Volodymyr Starobutsev that Tanya was referring to, who I just said happy birthday today to as well. So we are building concrete ties of solidarity, and the most important thing that we're doing is this nurses material aid campaign, because this is a vehicle to connect with the trade unions in the United States and show the commonality of the struggle that we face in the United States and globally. So you can sign up for the Ukraine Solidarity Network on the sign-up sheet. And if you're interested in hearing from somebody from Donetsk and Luhansk, the people's republics that supposedly Putin liberated, you can come to the Ukraine Solidarity Network and listen to somebody who was forced into exile by that invasion and occupation. His name is Alexander Kisilov, and he's writing some of the best stuff on the negotiations that you can read, just published in Jacobin and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation's website, about the kind of peace deal that's being forced on Ukraine and the struggle for the least worst ceasefire that Ukraine can possibly win. So if you want to come to that meeting on Zoom this weekend, get on the sign-up sheet and I'll make sure you get invited. So thank you all for coming out. Sign up, get the leaflets, tell your unions, get people to donate to the Nurses Drive.
And stay warm tonight.
And stay warm.
I hear it's a heat wave.
Frostbite outside.